Welcome back to Rooted in Impact, a United Way Coastal and Western Connecticut podcast. I'm your host, Ashley Gaudiano. Today, we're talking about something that impacts every aspect of our lives, connection. At a time when many people report feeling isolated or disconnected, communities across the country are exploring ways to strengthen relationships, foster belonging, and build bridges across differences. Today, I'm joined by Araba Sapara-Grant, Senior Manager for Community Activation at Weave, a national movement dedicated to strengthening the social fabric of communities by helping people connect, contribute, and build relationships where they live. And we'll dive into all of that as we explore why connection matters, what happens when communities invest in belonging, and how each of us can really play a role in creating stronger, more connected neighborhoods. So thank you for being here. I'm really excited for today's conversation.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, Ashley.
So let's just start at the beginning, right? For people who have no idea what Weave is and what and how that fits into your work, can you start and just tell us a little bit about organization, mission, etc.?
Yeah, of course. So the story of Weave really starts 8 years back with our founder, David Brooks. David Brooks, some folks listening might know, is an author and journalist. And, at that point in his life, again, 8 years ago, he was really dealing with being at a crossroads. He was coming out of a divorce, feeling very isolated. As you can imagine, someone who reports as much as he did was spending a lot of nights in a hotel room,
right?
Kind of, alone with his thoughts. And he tells this really, I think, important story of being at home, opening a drawer, and all that he found in there were Post-it notes instead of forks and knives and, all of the knickknacks that are kind of evidence of a life shared with someone. And so that moment of isolation and reflection really pivoted when he was invited to the home of one of his friends. And they, very astonishingly, I think, to David, opened up their home to their community on a weekly basis, primarily to adults, young adults and teenagers who were in need of connection and guidance. And that was really eye-opening for him. He continued to go to those dinners week after week after week after week. And I think that was really the light bulb for him to ask himself, who are the people who are recognizing that folks need connection, they need relationships, they need to feel a sense of belonging, to feel well and to feel seen in their community. And so that was really the starting point for what became Weave, the Social Fabric Project. David was able to partner with the Aspen Institute to do a listening session in geographies all across our country. He gathered folks to ask 3 questions. Who do you trust? Who shows up for people, and who are the leaders in your community? And it was from the responses to those questions that he was able to identify people around the country who we would soon call weavers. And these are the people who are really focused on relationship building in their community. They are open, they are welcoming, they help people feel seen and heard. And it's that work of relationship building that's the main focus of Weave the Social Fabric Project, because we recognize that relationships are really the foundation of social trust. And without social trust, it is so difficult to move forward as a community, as a country. And so there are really micro and macro levels to why feeling a sense of connection and belonging is important. And we realized that it was truly the weavers who were doing the unseen, overlooked and often uncelebrated work of making sure that relationship building happens. And so, yeah, that's a little bit about us. We, through our programming, try to uplift and connect weavers through what we call the Weaver Awards, which are an incredible set of programs across the country that are looking to identify and celebrate and acknowledge the work of weavers. And so it's been an incredible journey that it's just continuing to grow and scale through partners like United Way.
That is such a good description of what David set out to start and how that's being kind of transitioned into this award process. And really, the awards, at least in my mind, are a tool, right, to find and celebrate, but there's so much more underneath of there, and so much more to be built there. So I'm really excited that United Way is a part of that. I'm looking forward to launching that on our end in August. And so for those who are listening, more to come there. I love those three questions, right? Who do you trust? Who shows up? And who are the leaders in the community? I think we hear right now a lot about loneliness and social isolation and the need for community connectedness. Why do you think that's become such an important issue nationally? Why is that such a kind of hot topic, if you will, today?
Yeah, thank you so much for asking that. I think that there are two reasons why the question or the topic of loneliness and isolation is coming up. First, I think there is the mental health lens to it. You might remember that back in 2023, there was a Surgeon General advisory about the loneliness epidemic. And I think there were some really startling statistics that came out of that. You know, where he started through that advisory, learned about the impacts of loneliness on folks in terms of premature death. There was this, smoking equivalent that, social disconnection was similar to smoking up to 15 cigarettes a day. There are other statistics there about, the impact on cardiovascular disease or even dementia, that social isolation can increase risk of developing dementia by 50%. And so I think that is probably one reason why, the question of social isolation and disconnectedness had come up. But I think the thing that is probably more prevalent for a lot of people is the feeling that we have in our country that connection, collaboration, that our politics have kind of screeched to a halt. Our ability to solve problems together, either as a community, as a state, as a city, as a country, has become really challenging. And much of that has to do with a lack of social trust. And so for folks who might be listening and wondering, what social trust is, there are many definitions, but the one that we use is just generally the belief in the honesty, integrity, and reliability, of your fellow man or woman, your fellow community member, person. And without that trust, it makes it very difficult to come together to solve challenges. So whether that challenge is, a failing school or an empty lot, if you don't believe that the person, next to you in your community is operating with honesty and integrity, it makes it that much more challenging to come together. And I think at all levels of our society, at all levels of our government, folks are really feeling that disconnect and feeling that frustration that we cannot move forward on certain challenges. And so I do think that question of connection, how do we get back to a place where even if we don't agree, we can trust that the other people in our community are operating with a sense of honesty, integrity, and reliability. And unless you have relationships with those people, that's going to be very difficult for you to know. And so I think that is where this question and interest in connection is really coming from.
Yeah, I think that's a really important statement. And right, I want to tattoo that on my arm, right? Even if we don't agree, how can we trust, right? How can we be working from a basis of empathy, a basis of, good intent, right? I often talk about that in the workplace, right? How can we assume positive intent? And that's some of it, right? You have to know somebody to be able to do that. Otherwise, you can other someone so easily.
Exactly.
So there's a lot of value. Can you tie that, right? Connect that dotted line to the broader kind of community health, right? We've just talked a lot about an individual's health, big societal problems, which you and I aren't going to solve right here now. But how does connection and trust and relationships actually connect in to the well-being and resiliency of a community?
That's another fantastic question. I think the first thing that comes to mind for me when I think about the health and resiliency of a community is how that community interacts with its institutions. And so you might have organizations, institutions, whether it's local government, a school, a hospital, whose main focus and mission is to support the health and resiliency of a community. However, when you have these breakdowns in trust, it becomes that much harder for these institutions to do their job. For any sort of intervention to work, whether it's an education intervention or an economic intervention, it requires there to be trust in the people who are leading that intervention. And so, there is a link between interpersonal trust and I think then at a broader level, trust in institutions. And so I think that's a really, what do I want to say, kind of like practical way to think about how a lack of trust can impact the resilience of a community. Another thing that comes to mind is, how a community stays resilient in the face of a crisis, an unexpected crisis, whether that is extreme weather or anything else that could happen. If that community has taken the time to build strong bonds between neighbors, when the crisis strikes, we already have each other's phone numbers. We already know, where everyone lives. We've already invested in, kind of like the community plan of, where everyone needs to go. Is it the basement of the middle school or what have you? And that kind of communal planning on how we're going to get through this. When the crisis strikes, I don't want to say it's too late, but when the crisis strikes, it can make it that much harder to now start trying to reach out to people that you don't know. In times of crisis and times of fear, we might even feel more averse to reaching out to folks because the risk is that much higher. You don't know if this is someone who's going to have your best interest in mind or someone who's going to take advantage of you in a time of vulnerability. So if you can build that trust before the crisis comes, that will just so much more help a community stay resilient. And so those are the two examples.
Yeah, those are great examples. I think a lot about mutual aid networks, right?
Absolutely.
And part of why, or the SNAP crisis that happened when your neighbors, you trust in having access to food and resources, to caregiving, right? All of those things at a super neighborhood level. And then you extrapolate that out to the institutional level and beyond. So I think those are two great examples. Before we dive into a commercial break, I thought that I would just ask you if you have a story that you love about a weaver that you've met, right? Somebody or a great example of what that weaving concept looks like in practice. Is there a story you would want to highlight there?
Yeah, absolutely. So I had the great pleasure of going down to Northwest Arkansas to visit some folks that our team has engaged. And so just to give a little bit of context for folks that aren't familiar with Weave. So after the listening tour that I mentioned, that was led by David Brooks, we started piloting the Weaver Awards and different activities in different communities. So we went to Baltimore, we went to Wilkesboro, North Carolina, and most recently to Northwest Arkansas. I think, some of the learnings that we had from those experiences was that for this work to really take root, it needs to be led by organizations that are rooted in community, who know the context, who know the dynamics, and who can really make it, for and by a community, which is why we are partnering with community hosts like the United Way. And so that's the future of Weave. However, we are in the process. Yeah, it's I think a really, really great evolution of the work. However, we are in the process now of wrapping up our last cohort of Weaver awardees in Northwest Arkansas. And so I got to go down and visit a few folks, and I met an individual by the name of Nur. He was new to the Northwest Arkansas area, which I don't have the statistic off of my head, but it is a region that is rapidly changing. We have a lot of folks coming from other parts of the country. We have folks coming from other parts of the world, to live in that area. And as you can imagine, with a community that, you have folks who were born and raised, you have, a little bit of transients, you have folks who are new Americans, all of that different, those combinations. It can be really isolating. How do you make friends? Where do you go to connect with people? And so NER created something called the Vibe Tribe, which is which is such a cool name.
I want to go be a part of that.
Right, exactly. I was like, I want to be a part of the Vibe Tribe. But basically, it started off as a speed friending event. So folks could just come together and kind of very similar to speed dating, speed friending, you get a chance to talk to different people who attended this event. And it was open to anyone who was interested in attending. It happened on a regular basis. And from there, relationships started to build where you don't have to rely on the speed friending aspect because folks had already met each other. And from there, you started to see this growth of kind of organic hangs, like people saying like, oh, it was so great to meet you at the, speed friending event. And I saw you at the one, that was a couple weeks later, like we should all get together and go bowling, or we should all get together and go on a hike. And I think what he's done has really demonstrated what we call the 4 qualities of weaving. So first, it needs to be local. So that we feel is so important. I know that there's a lot of connection that can happen online, but despite social media, we are still, look at the data, lonelier than ever. And so connecting in person and locally at a neighborhood level, city level is very important. It should be mutual. There should be an opportunity to give and take. This is not something that's meant to be transactional or, you are a beneficiary of my good nature and my goodwill. We're both giving and receiving value, even that if that value is just time with another person or friendship. The third is welcoming, it being open to anyone who's looking for a connection. And then finally, continuous, because as anyone knows, to make friends, it is not a one-time thing. Although there are those like moments of like serendipity where you just meet your, your twin flame, but it takes time.
It does.
So that continuous exposure is what really helps create those relationships. And I think the work that he's done with the Vibe Tribe is just such a great example of that. But there are so many different great examples of weaving that are around, building communal spaces like community gardens. There are folks who are weaving through food security and food services. And it's really what I say, it's not so much what you're doing, it's how you're doing it. So how are you centering mutuality and centering relationship building in the activities that you're doing?
That's a great example. And I know that if you go online, you can see other wonderful examples of weavers. I know that we have so many people here in our community who are doing incredible work like that. And sometimes it's finding and providing the space and opportunity to lift them up. So I know that's one of the things I'm really looking forward to about this is having the opportunity to highlight and think creatively with those individuals, alongside those individuals. When you think about next steps with Weave, what's the future of this movement and this concept look like?
Yeah. The future of Weave is organizations like the United Way. Like I was saying earlier, a big lesson coming out of our pilots of the Weaver Awards is that for the work to take root, and for it to really identify people who are really making a difference, like the true weavers in the community, it needs to be led by an organization that is already in place, that knows who the community leaders are, who know the channels to get to the weavers in their community. So an amazing thing about weavers is that they are usually so heads down doing incredible work, and, don't even see the work that they're doing as something that would be worthy of an award or a grant or a recognition. And so oftentimes it takes a local organization or, group of advisors or leaders to tap that person on the shoulder and say, hey, what you're doing is incredible. It's worthy of acknowledgement and celebration, and it's actually going to help inspire other people in this community to continue to do it. And so we at the Aspen Institute really wanted to step aside and share our learnings and best practices, our tools and our resources with local organizations, and we've been calling them, community hosts, to be able to run the awards in their community. And I really think that decentralization is going to lead, my hope is, to a national movement where together, we're starting with 25 community hosts that will grow to 50 next year and then 75 the year after that. And, hopefully even more in the years following. What we're hoping is that each of these organizations with their unique platforms and networks and resources can really help elevate the importance of weaving, the importance of relationship building, connection, and, really combating the isolation that we're facing in our country. We can help elevate that to a national level where the narrative that so many of us are observing on a daily basis can really be countered with these stories of folks who are, welcoming people in, building relationships, and, developing social trust in their communities and building one community at a time.
Well, it couldn't have come at a better moment in time in our country, I think, to really be looking at this and talking about how to do differently, engage differently, and really, again, repair some of this polarization that has happened, compounded by a pandemic, right? A global pandemic.
Yes.
And all of these other factors, right, that have led to this moment of isolation, distrust, kind of fractured communities. So I just think it's such a relevant time to engage in this. I know we're coming to the end of our time, so I wanted to pick your brain on two more things.
Of course.
One is, are you all looking at outcomes around this, right? What happens if you invest in weavers? What do you see in terms of isolation and connection and trust? What are you looking at there, if anything?
Yeah, that's a great question. Monitoring and evaluation is such an important part of this work. And I think something that we're really investing in as we bring in community hosts, because now we have an opportunity to look at, across 25 different organizations who are all approaching this work in a similar way, but with their own, special twist. What are the impacts that you see? And I think it's, something that we always have to remind ourselves and remind others is that when you're trying to measure trust, that is a long term
game.
Yeah, this is a very long game, situation. It's not going to be something where, in a year and a half, you're able to say, like, this community is now more trusting.
Right. Right. Not at all.
Yeah, but to share with you what we are thinking. In the short term, what we want to look for are changes in engagement. So with each weaver that is, provided with an award, they will have different projects that they're working on that are designed to help strengthen relationships. Sometimes the goal will just be to strengthen relationships and connection, and sometimes the relationships and connection are a means to another end, such as solving a community problem. And so we'll be observing, how does engagement change or potentially increase as, more and more weavers are out in the community? Are they able to draw in community members that, perhaps haven't been as engaged previously, whether it's with volunteerism or, civic engagement or other types of, community opportunities, for folks to come out and engage with one another and support. So that's something that you can see in the immediate term. I've had a community cleanup event and this many people came out. And as I continue to do it, more folks come out, more folks build relationship from there.
Yeah.
I think from there, we start to think about the changes in people's mindsets. How are folks changing the perceptions that they have of their community? Do they start to believe that their community is one that is trusting, where people are honest, where people have integrity and reliability? And that's really coming from some of the statistics that I mentioned at the beginning from the Pew Research Center, that less of half of U.S. adults said that they trust most or all of their neighbors. U.S. adults are more likely to say their fellow Americans are morally bad than good.
Right.
Can we start to see a shift in that at the community level? And then I think in the long term, and this is something that may or may not happen during the life of the project, is really understanding whether norms start to change in a community. Is it now a norm in our community to weave, to build relationships, to come to, tables with others who, we may or may not agree with, to try to address some of the challenges that we might face? And that, I think, is the ultimate goal of Weave, is to make social trust a norm in the United States. And so there are a number of different, measures that we're using, on the engagement side, definitely more quantitative. And I think later on with some of the things I mentioned, that it is more like qualitative and like perception based and self-reported. But I think it'll give us a lot of, great insight into how investing in Weavers and activities like the Weaver Awards can help move the needle in communities.
That's really helpful. And here in Connecticut, we're really lucky to have some great data partners who do community well-being reports and index on a regular basis. And so I think there's a real opportunity, especially where those things exist at the community and local level, to start to see some of that data. Again, not short term, you're not going to see that overnight, but how do you look at baselines and then go out a few years and see what's happened over the course of a 4-year period of running a program?
Yeah, exactly.
And then I'll end with this because we are at time. For people who want to strengthen connection where they live, what's one simple step or one piece of advice that you would give to them that they can do today?
I'm going to break your rules. I'm just going to offer 2 things.
I love to. Go ahead. Break the rules. That's fine.
I think one of them is so simple. And this is something that our executive director, Fred Riley, always says, is that, wherever he is, if he's getting on an elevator, if he's walking into a room, he looks folks in the eye and he says, and he greets them, "Good morning, good afternoon." And he always shares like how much it can disarm people sometimes, especially if someone's been feeling particularly isolated. I know, especially, I live in a city and folks are, walking down the sidewalk trying to get to the metro or get to where they need to be. And there's so little time taken to just acknowledge the human in front of you and to greet them and, look them in the eye. And it's such a small thing, but if you're really looking for kind of the lowest hanging fruit of how to start to build connection, that's what I would say. And then the next action that I would recommend, and this is one that we use ourselves in our, Weave programming, we call it coffee and conversation, is just inviting folks to coffee. And it can be at your home. It could be at a local coffee shop, extra points versus supporting a locally owned business.
For a small business. Yeah.
For a small business. And it's just a very low stakes way to get to know folks. And we've known folks who have held a coffee and conversation that was just open. We're all just here trying to get to know each other, folks in the community. Sometimes folks might plan one around a specific topic. And so it can be, we're all folks who work in health. And so we want to get together and, have coffee and talk about the different health programming in our community. But it also doesn't have to rise to that level. I've seen some gatherings of folks who all have hounds, and so no matter what type of hound you have, basset hound, any type of hound you have, let's get together.
Let's get together.
Let's bring our hounds. And over time, as we can continue these meetups, we'll develop relationships with each other. And so I really want to drive home for folks that are listening to think about what interests you and put the call out there. Because based on these statistics that, we've talked about today around loneliness, we know that there are folks who are just looking for an opportunity, just looking for the invitation. And it can be kind of scary to be the one to put the invitation out, but you're surprised at who responds.
Yeah, well, I love coffee and conversations. We do coffee and conversations with nonprofit leaders in our community, and it's an open opportunity to come just sit in our office and chat. So I think that's such a good recommendation. And I do think it can be scary. And sometimes you have to take a little bit of that brave and bold step to be the one that says, I'm going to open my home or meet somewhere or ask people to join me. But I think if we're feeling like this, right, there are so many other people who are out there feeling the same way who, like you said, are going to receive that and want to take that step with you. So I love the encouragement. I think it's a great place to start. And I hope that people listening maybe just start with the good morning or the good afternoon or have a good night to the stranger in the elevator. So that's fantastic. Thank you so much for joining me today. It was really wonderful to learn about Weave, to share how you all are thinking about this work in building connection and creating stronger, more resilient, more trusting communities. And as I said, I'm really looking forward to getting Weave launched in Fairfield County, Connecticut in the next month or so. So thank you so much. I'm Ashley Gaudiano, and this is Rooted in Impact. Thank you for listening.
Thank you.
In every community, there are people who quietly bring others together, organizing neighbors, supporting families, and building connections that make all the difference. These individuals are called weavers. They strengthen relationships, create belonging, and help solve local challenges, often without recognition or resources. That's why United Way Coastal and Western Connecticut is bringing the Weaver Awards to our region. Through this initiative, we're celebrating and supporting these everyday changemakers with micro grants and visibility to grow their impact. Because when neighbors come together, trust grows and communities grow stronger. Be part of the movement by nominating a weaver, applying, or helping spread the word. Applications open August 3rd, 2026. Visit unitedwaycwc.org/Weaver Awards to learn more.